Good day. What a great opportunity this is, and thank you for the opportunity to chat to you for a few moments today about one of the lost virtues within organizational leadership. I've entitled this particular presentation, Transforming Our Work into Worship, Diligence as an Organizational and Leadership Virtue. When public leadership is merely described in terms of money, as is evident in the theme song of Donald Trump's television show, The Apprentice, or the business section of the newspaper USA Today, leadership and organizational labor turns from the purpose of ends it once had towards the sole pursuit of financial goals as ends in themselves. In this context, leadership is no longer about the honor of leading or labor. It is about the accumulation of wealth, prestige, and power. But of course, this was not always so. John MacDonald, in his 1886 book entitled Elements Necessary for the Formation of a Business Character or of Business Character, asked the central question of his day, and in my mind, maybe one that needs to be asked in this age again. He asked this question: where are the men in any of our cities who are the leaders of men? His answer was a simple one, but a provocative one, and one that would form the basis of his persuasive argument more than 100 years old. He answered this question with this simple answer: they are the diligent. For MacDonald, the virtue of diligence would be of prime importance in the moral formation of leaders. In an effort to underscore the eternal nature of this reality, he ends his very short book, about 36 pages, with a quotation from the book of Proverbs, in particular Proverbs 21 verse 5, and it reads, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to plenty, but those of everyone who is hasty surely to poverty." This paper presents a short review of the theological and ethical understanding and praxis of diligence, and proposes a threefold ethical perspective on the implications of this virtue in the leadership virtue of course, diligence in organizational leadership. Number one, the diligent leader learns to value the organization and its followers. Secondly, the diligent leader constructs organizations of care and joy. And thirdly, the diligent leader redefines, in some ways at least, the redemptive nature of work for the organization and its followers. Let's start off by discussing for a few moments the origin and progress of diligence as a virtue. The virtue of diligence is part of a Christian list of 7 virtues, originally named by the Christian poet Aurelius Prudentius Clemens in the late 4th to early 5th century. And of course, this was based on the Nicomachean ethics of the Greek philosopher Aristotle, as well as the wisdom writings of the Old Testament, and in particular the teachings of the Apostles Paul and Peter in the New Testament. The Greek word used by the New Testament authors to describe the virtue of diligence is the Greek word spoude, and its closest meaning is the disposition to think and act with a proper sense of urgency and zeal. The original term literally meant to make haste or to be eager. The Apostle Paul lists diligence as a central Christian virtue in his second letter to the Corinthian church, in particular here chapter 8 and verse 7. I'm quoting from this text. "But as you abound in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, and in all diligence, and in your love for us, see that you abound in this grace also." The Apostle Paul echoes this Pauline sentiment and places diligence in both of his list of virtues in his second letter, in particular the first chapter of his second letter. Later on, the desert fathers and mothers of the late 3rd century would use the virtue of diligence as part of their spiritual arsenal against the temptations of the evil one. The great medieval theologian later on, St. Thomas Aquinas, of course 13th century, would refer to the virtue of diligence by the term of solicitude and of course vigilance. In St. Aquinas' use of these terms, he proposes that the virtue of diligence includes the values of love and care. By the way, this would be a theme that would run through almost all of Christian history and theological reflection on this virtue. To be diligent is to take care to do what we value or prize. St. Aquinas writes in his great Codex Summa Theologica, specifically here question 54, and I quote, "Diligence seems to be the same as solicitude, because the more we love a thing, the more solicitous are we about it. Yet diligence, no less than solicitude, is required for every action, insofar as due acts of reason are requisite for every virtue." In the mind of St. Aquinas, negligence is the opposite vice of the virtue of diligence. If negligence is the value of choosing to love and care, negligence is the refusal to notice, to love, or care. Once again, the medieval doctor of the church enlightens when he instructs, and once again from Summa Theologica, there's one clear statement: negligence denotes the lack of due care. Diligence with regards to organizational leadership has received far less attention in the wealth of reflection than, of course, in the wealth of reflection and literature on this virtue in moral and systematic theology. In an effort to categorize virtues in business leadership, Solomon here, one of the authors in business research specifically, constructed a list of over 40 virtues. The absence of the virtue of diligence is noteworthy. But in the last number of years, as leadership scholars and authors started to move back towards a values-based approach of leadership, images of leaders once again started to include the virtue of diligence as a descriptor. In sociological and economic studies, diligence has historically been counted as one of the three overarching virtues of a traditional work ethic. The other two virtues being hard work and responsibility. One example of this renewed attention that the virtue is getting is in how the Josephine Institute, a U.S. non-profit organization that works to increase ethical commitment, competence, and practice in organizations, rates diligence as a key component in organizational ethics and moral formation. Recent lists of leadership traits have included the virtue of diligence as a key descriptor of what leaders do. Some current researchers have even gone so far as to list the virtue of diligence as one of the key indicators of leadership success and effectiveness. Further evidence of the resurgence of this virtue is the discussions within sociological and economic research in which diligence has been described as one of the industrial virtues and sometimes even at times as a key entrepreneurial virtue. In recent years, the virtue of diligence has also been used as one of the benchmark factors that describe spiritual leadership. It's also important to note that diligence is also not seen any longer as exclusively a Western virtue, as sometimes has been described in the previous centuries. One of the researchers, Bekker, reports that amongst many of the other similar groupings in Africa, that the Kenyan people group, the Gigeo, measures leadership development by the virtue, predominantly of diligence. It seems that the more researchers consider the virtue of diligence, the more evidence is found for its universal and practical appeal. Let me for a few moments now speak about contemporary definitions of diligence. What is diligence? For both Jews and Christians, diligence has always been central to the moral perspective of both communities. Diligence is traditionally listed as both integral to Jewish biblical virtues and is one of the 7 Christian theological virtues. But the contemporary definitions of diligence is wider than the biblical and theological research and reflection. One of the researchers, Barak, defines the virtue of diligence as the decision to fulfill all of the responsibilities in our vocation or state of life. A diligent person is defined by the very common American Webster's Dictionary as being characterized by steady, earnest, and energetic application and effort. The researchers Murphy, Laxniak, and Wood describe the diligent person as having persevering application, and also, again, describes diligence as the attention and care legally expected or required of a person. Swain, another researcher, in a reflection on the ethics of officers, leaders in the United States Army, places diligence as one of the core leadership requirements and defines diligence in the context as the manner in which officers approach their responsibilities, and note here, with quotation marks, with painstaking care and perseverance. Another researcher, Dudu, in a recent article that explores leadership effectiveness in academic medicine, proposes that diligence is a key component together with hard work and research focus. This is one of the ways that academics should measure their own leadership. It seems that in a survey of the literature on the virtue of diligence and in the great focus of the literature specifically within the Jewish and Christian tradition, that virtue can be linked in organizational leaders with 3 ethical implications. And for a moment, I would like to discuss these 3. Let me start with the first one. The first one, of course, here is the diligent leader learns to value the organization and its followers. The virtue of diligence has been described as pivotal in the formation of moral character in Christian ministers. The researchers Nat Gant, Oates, and Menifee argue that the Hebrew and Christian scriptures are replete with occurrences where diligence is highlighted not only as a virtue, but as a virtuous characteristic and is linked with the attitudes of promptness, preparedness, and thoroughness in the vocation in which each person finds him or herself. This speaks about the process of Christian vocational and leadership formation. And the question is here, of course, is how does diligence bring about this change? One way that this virtue does this is in the nature of production, asking the simple and yet basic question of why do we work? What is the purpose of my labor? What is the purpose of my leadership? In the Christian Catholic tradition, the classical virtue of diligence has been linked to the economic processes of production for the economic common good of all. In the papal document Centesimus Annus, of course, this came from 1991, that celebrated the centennial anniversary of the influential papal teaching by Pope Leo XIII in 1893 on the nature of work, a document known commonly as Rerum Novarum. Pope John Paul II argued that the virtue of diligence is clearly linked to the creation of stable communities of economic welfare that are able to transform natural and human environments for the good. It is, and here I quote from the document, it is his disciplined work in close collaboration with others that makes possible the creation of ever more extensive working communities which can be relied upon to transform man's natural and human environments, end quote. Important virtues are involved in this process, such as diligence, industriousness, prudence in undertaking reasonable risks, reliability and fidelity in interpersonal relationships, as well as courage in carrying out decisions which are difficult and painful but necessary, both for the overall working of a business and in meeting possible setbacks. Actually, here's the end of the quote. Another researcher, Norton and Laxniak, in 1993 echoed the sentiments of Centesimus Annus and proposed that the virtue of diligence has a transformative value, and here, start quote, perfects the human person while at the same time perfecting society, end quote. In the marketplace, diligence must be considered as one of the repertoire of Judeo-Christian morality, and often, of course, is listed as among the virtues of discretion, honesty, and fortitude. These are all virtues that lead to the moral formation of the leader in the marketplace, and one could also argue in any other organizational context. Diligent leaders acquire the virtue of leadership precisely because they've learned that the purpose of their leadership is the common good of all. A new love arises in the hearts of these leaders for the organization and the followers, and thus careful attention is offered to both. The second ethical imperative that diligence brings to organizational leadership is this imperative that the diligent leader constructs organizations of care and joy. The researcher Solom, in a recent article exploring the nature of a virtue orientation in choosing judges, remarks that the virtue of diligence is characterized by an attitude of enjoying one's work and careful attention to one's responsibilities. Starting quote here, Solom speaks, closely related to diligence is the discipline of carefulness, end quote. The virtue of diligence, the ability to provide exceptional attention and care to both the labor we do and the people we lead, make part of what kind of leaders, of course, should do. In the virtue of diligence, if the virtue of diligence is to see, love, and to provide care in labor for what we treasure, it's important to recognize that this, of course, should bring us great joy. The Old Testament book, Qoheleth, of course, commonly known as Ecclesiastes, as part of the larger wisdom literature of the Hebrew Scriptures, provide a vision that diligent labor could involve joy. By implication, of course, yet speaking about diligence. Quoting here from the book, chapter 2, verse 10, "For my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward for all of my labor." A biblical view of work includes the ethical obligations for leaders to provide an honest day work. One can compare in the Old Testament Jacob's instructions to the slothful shepherds in Genesis 29. Also, it includes the imperative to construct work that is dignified and meaningful. One can think here of the instructions of, the necessary instructions of a humane orientation and treatment towards servants and even slaves in the book of Leviticus. Here, one can particularly look at chapter 25. It would stand to reason that in order to do this, we have to construct organizations of care and joy. Organizations with followers, organizations, of course, here, where followers can learn to trust and have faith again. In the Jewish tradition, some arguments have been made that the dichotomy between faith and works should not be so sharply drawn. For Judaism, deeds are faithful, as one researcher would say, or better, deeds become faith. This sentiment is echoed in the very Jewish letter of James in the New Testament. And I'm reading here from James 2:26, where it says, "For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also." The question remains, of course, how do we do this? The leadership author and consultant Richard Bekker, Dennis Bekker in actual fact, highly influenced by a Christian theology of virtues and work, in a revolutionary book, proposes 10 propositions that would transform organizations into organizations of care and joy. Bekker's 10 propositions build on the descriptors of diligence in both the Jewish and Christian traditions, where diligence is described as a virtue that's marked by love and attention of care. I thought it would be helpful to maybe just list Bekker's 10 propositions. And as I list them, think for a moment how much these propositions describe the values of diligence, of this virtue of diligence that we've mentioned before. Bekker's first proposition is, when given the opportunity to use our ability to reason, make decisions, and to take responsibility for our actions, people experience joy at work. One can immediately think how important this aspect of paying attention, careful attention to our reality to work speaks about this proposition. The second proposition of Bekker is that the main purpose of an organization is never to maximize profits, but rather to steward our resources to serve the world and to make a positive contribution. Bekker's third proposition is that a workplace can be a place of both meaning and fun, both aspects that are often used to describe the virtue of diligence. Bekker's fourth proposition is that leaders should endeavor to eliminate overmanagement, organizational charge, job descriptions, and hourly wages. I love what he says here. He says that leaders should hire hearts and not time. The fifth proposition of Bekker is that fairness means treating everybody differently, according to their needs and preferences. And once again here, Bekker, in a genius manner, connects with this discipline of diligence. If diligence is about paying attention, leaders that construct organizations of care and joy, focus on their followers and so treat them as they would need. The sixth proposition of Bekker is that principles and values must govern all decisions. Leaders must lead by virtues. And once again, it connects with this aspect of due diligence, even maybe, that one should be careful in how we make decisions. It must be virtuous decisions. The next proposition of Bekker is that leaders should put other stakeholders and workers above themselves. A following one is that everyone must get advice before making a decision. A second last one is that a good decision should not satisfy everyone, but that it should be measured by the values of the organization. And finally, and maybe the one where Bekker connects mostly with this incredible virtue of diligence, is that leaders must lead not only with an awareness, a focus on their followers, but with passion, humility, and organizational love. Diligent leaders not only create organizations of joy, they focus on the follower and the work with great attentiveness. Swain, once again a researcher here, connects leadership diligence with vigilance when he writes, start quote, "Diligence in leadership requires vigilance in oversight." The researchers Kidder and McLean Parks link diligence in military leaders with overt conscientiousness. And one can think here, of course, again about this aspect of being awake and aware and present in the moment. All of those descriptors of this virtue of diligence. Keith Walker, in exploring the value of diligence in academic leadership, defines diligent leadership as a leadership characteristic that's marked by exceptional care as present to the follower. And let me read to you what Keith writes here, deeply moving. He writes, "What do I mean by diligence? I mean purposeful, wide awake, imaginative, competent, and fully engaged leadership. The concept of diligence implies that the educational leader highly values and esteems their responsibilities and relationships. To the extent that an educational leader is diligent, they will take delight in their carefully and consistently purposed efforts with people and purpose." Lastly, I want to discuss for a few moments the third possible ethical imperative that the virtue of diligence brings to organizational leadership. And this is the imperative that the diligent leader defines the redemptive nature of work for the organization and its followers. Research on the nature of a traditional work ethic, sometimes referred to as a Protestant work ethic, proposes that it's related to internally held values. Of course, it was Max Weber, the very famous sociologist, who coined the phrase a Protestant ethic when he argued in his 1958 text, a text entitled The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, that Calvinists, Puritans, Pietists, and other Christian groups in the West, start quote, systematized their labor in order to demonstrate true faith through works and thus prove to themselves with certainty that they were among the saved. These, of course, all speak about deeply inner values. The value of diligence as more than just hard work, but rather an alternative view of work, is often listed as one of the constituents of such a particular work ethic. For researchers that have examined the nature of work in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, this of course comes as no surprise. Biblical scholars have argued that work in the Old Testament is deeply and positively stamped by its association with God. According to the sacred scriptures, Adam and Eve, created in the image of God, as would be noticed in the book of Genesis, were placed in a garden purposefully with the purpose to labor. But this labor was not originally meant to include the painful toil that the fall would bring. There was an original divine balance in work, as the researcher Brown argues. Start quote, the Bible's work ethic is derived from its rest ethic, mandated in the Sabbath command and established to check the temptation to turn work, however meaningful and productive, into toil, end quote. It is by no accident that the original Hebrew word utilized by the Old Testament text for work, the word avodah, is exactly the same one that is used for worship. In the sacred text of the Old Testament, to work was to worship, and to worship was to work. We still have a sense of this in the word we use to describe worship in our churches today, the word liturgy, which in its original Latin context meant the work of the people. Again, work is worship, and it seems that worship certainly should be part of what we do as work. Work in the Judeo-Christian tradition is more than worship, it is also seen as a vocation, as an act of obedience unto God. In the Jewish tradition, work is seen as a holy act because it is done as a way to emulate God in His creation of the heavens and the earth. We work because God's working. In a document entitled Economic Justice for All, it was a document written by the United States, of course, Conference of Catholic Bishops in 1987. The authors of this document communicated this Christian perspective of vocation and work as it really relates to the virtue of diligence when they write, business people, managers, investors, and financiers follow a vital Christian vocation when they act responsibly and seek the common good. We encourage and support a renewed sense of vocation in all the business community. End quote. It's important to note here that all vocation, at least within moral theology historically, has been seen as a response to God. The virtue of diligence, of course, is no different. The diligent leader practices diligence because God is diligence. It is precisely because God is not only aware of His followers and not only aware of His work, that He diligently works and takes care and provides context of joy and meaning, that the diligent Christian leader endeavors to do the same. Again, the diligent leader practices diligence because God is seen as diligent. In the Christian tradition, labor is further seen as something that might be part of a larger redemptive process. The monastic father and leader John Cassian, of course, late 4th century, early 5th century, wrote volumes on the sin of sloth, sometimes called acedia, this kind of moral sloth. Also wrote quite a fair bit on the virtue of diligence. And when writing on the dangers of the sins of sloth and acedia, and really in response to the Apostle Paul's exhortation of manual labor, proposes that one could heal the wounds of laziness through the process of diligent labor. Listen to what he says here, and this comes from, of course, the very famous Institutes of Cassian, and this is in chapter 14. He writes, "The cause of all these ulcers which spring from the root of idleness He heals, he's speaking about Paul here, he heals like some well-skilled physician by a single salutary charge to work, as he knows that all the other bad symptoms which spring, as it were, from the same clump will once disappear when the cause of the chief malady has been removed. It is this quest to communicate the incarnational and redemptive nature of work. Let me just say, that was the end of the quote. It is in this quest to communicate the incarnational and redemptive nature of work, specifically in Cassian, that the diligent leader provides a new perspective on the work that takes place in the organization. And in this, a very new perspective on the very nature of the organization. One can immediately, of course, think of somebody like Benedict of Nursia, that in his restructure of the Christian community, right at the beginning of Western monasticism, that Benedict understood that very same issue. Benedict would say, well, how do you heal issues of sin? How do you heal issues of moral failure? Remember, very famously, he would say, orate labora, prayer and work. The researcher Walkes argues that an incarnated understanding of both business and leadership might assist in the moral formation of organizations. Instead of thinking, he would write, about business as making money, we might once again think of it as doing good work that participates in divine work. Let me conclude with a few thoughts on the virtue of diligence as it relates to organizational leadership. Diligence in labor and leadership carry with it a divine reward, as it's witnessed in the exhortation from the New Testament letter to the Hebrews. And here I'm reading from chapter 6, verses 10 to 12. And I quote, "For God is not unjust to forget your work and labor of love, which you have shown towards his name, in what you have ministered to the saints and do minister. And we desire that each of you show the same diligence to the full assurance of hope until the end, that you do not become sluggish, but imitate those who through faith and patience inherited the promises." End quote. Maybe one of the greatest rewards of diligent leadership is the ability to open up new avenues of reality for the followers as a way of defining organizational reality. Keith Walker once again writes, start quote, "Diligence is focused, careful hard work that delights in its obligations to make decisions, embraces attitudes and conducts actions that are both value and purpose driven. Diligent leaders work not only for the common good, but the higher ground. They give significance to transcendence rather than a narrow view of reality. Diligent leaders guard and generate warranted hope." End quote. What is diligence? The virtue of diligence in both the Jewish and Christian tradition seem to indicate that diligence is about awareness. And once we become aware of the work that needs to be done, we construct organizations of love and joy, and we as leaders provide diligent care not only to our labor, but also to the people that we lead. One can think of the use of diligence today mostly. It's mostly used in this construct where folks speak about due diligence. That's exactly what it is. Maybe once again learn the value of diligent labor and leadership. Maybe the virtue of diligence can once again be seen for what it is: a loving, careful attention to that which ultimately matters, a way to imitate God and to provide followers of a new way to see and understand the world that is around them, and also as a way to participate in God's healing of this world. And so we will once again find that God is not far from our presence and our labor. He is not far from our organizations. He is indeed a diligent God, a God that is aware and cares, and not only cares, but provide great joy and meaning in the everyday, ordinary labor that we do. I'm going to end this presentation with the words of the very famous Christian leader and author, Teilhard de Chardin. And he wrote this more than 50 years ago. Let me read this to you. He says, "God, in all that is most living and incarnate in him, is not far away from us, altogether apart from the world we see, touch, hear, smell, and taste about us. Rather, he awaits us in every instant in our action, in the work of the moment. There is a sense in which he, this is God, is at the tip of my pen, my spade, my brush, my needle. By pressing the stroke, the line, or the stitch on which I'm engaged to its ultimate natural finish, I shall lay hold of that last end towards which my innermost will tend." The time has come for us to recover the virtue of diligence in our quest to imitate God. Thank you so much for this opportunity. God bless.